Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining the Education Writers Association today for our webinar, How to Cover the School Voucher Expansion. I'm Nirvi Shah, the Education Enterprise Editor for USA Today, and I will be moderating this panel, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot, and I'm sure you will too. Before we begin, we have just a few housekeeping items to keep our webinar running smoothly, and you'll find those in the chat. And if you have questions for our speakers, if you can use the Q&A button there on your screen, if you can let us know your name and your affiliation, you can ask your question anytime. You don't have to wait till the end, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. But please feel free to ask them as they come up. We will be sending you a link to an evaluation survey at the end of this program, and we really hope that you can take the time to complete that. It's super important to help us plan future events and let us know how we did today. So school vouchers, they're called all kinds of different names: education savings accounts, empowerment scholarships, but the concept is the same. Families can use taxpayer money to help cover the cost of private schools, pay for books and other materials for homeschooling, and cover the cost of services such as speech or physical therapy for kids who aren't attending public schools. Over the past 2 years in particular, more than 20 states have started or expanded vouchers. These include Arizona, Florida, Indiana, New Hampshire, and West Virginia. Some states tweaked longstanding programs. Others created new programs with few or no limits on who can access public dollars. We're going to do a deep dive into voucher expansion today. I'm so delighted to introduce today's speakers. We have Darrell Bradford, the president of 50 CAN, which is an organization that trains and supports local education advocates to create change in their communities and states. Darrell supports the expansion of vouchers as one way of promoting parental choice. We also have Kara Fitzpatrick. She's a story editor at Chalkbeat. She's also author of the book, The Death of Public School, about the history of school vouchers, tracing the concept across 6 decades of American political life. And it also is a history of all school choice, including charter schools, although those won't be an integral part of our conversation today. And despite the book's title, she does not fall on one side or the other of the school voucher debate. And we also have Jessica Levin. She's Deputy Litigation Director at the Education Law and Director of Public Funds, Public Schools, a campaign to ensure public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools. PFPS opposes private school voucher programs and protects public education through litigation, advocacy, and research. I'm just going to kick things off. Let's get right into it. Darrell, why do you support school voucher expansion, and what are some of the consequences if vouchers become widespread?
So thank you for having me today, Nirvi, and I'd also like to thank the Education Writers Association and my co-panelists. My reason for supporting vouchers and sort of all kinds of school choice is very personal. So one of the earliest conversations I can remember is my mother and my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table at my house in Southwest Baltimore, talking about whose address we would use so that I could go to the middle school I was not zoned for. And I didn't realize until much later in life that conversation can get you sent to jail. You can get fined for doing that. It is illegal to go to a school for which you are not zoned. And I was very lucky and wound up going to an independent all boys day school for the back part of my middle school years and my high school years. And as a very nervous and anxious kid, it was the best thing that ever could have happened to me. I'm sort of deeply impacted and grateful for that. And I work on this issue because I want every other kid to have the same kind of opportunity that I had to attend the school that works best for them, regardless of where they live, who their parents are, or the color of their skin. And so again, thank you very much for having me today.
Jessica, you feel kind of exactly the opposite about vouchers in a sense. Tell me why, and what are some of the consequences that you worry about?
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you all. The reason that Public Funds Public Schools is a campaign to ensure that our public funds for education stay in our public schools is because vouchers don't do any good, and they actually do a great deal of harm. So there's an ever-increasing body of research that shows that vouchers have the following effects. They negatively affect student achievement, they exacerbate school segregation, they give public money to schools that openly discriminate, and they undermine the public school systems that welcome and serve all students. So I'd be happy to say a little bit more about all of that, but the bottom line is that that voucher programs are legally very dubious, that they're not good policy and they don't make common sense. So continuing to enact them is going against the ever-growing body of research that shows those negative effects that I just summarized. So it couldn't be, because public education is the cornerstone of our democracy, this couldn't be a more important issue. And I'm thrilled that everyone here today is interested in writing more about this. So thank you so much for hosting this.
Kara, I know you've spent the last several years just digging into the history of these programs. So can you put the current debate about vouchers into context by giving us some history of maybe how we got here? It seems like to me that there's been an explosion of programs, but I'd love to know more about what you think.
Sure. And I just want to thank everyone for having me. And also I warned my fellow panelists that I'm getting over a cold. So if I start coughing, I have some drinks and cough drops, but bear with me a little bit. So I've been researching this history for about 5 years now, and then have recently completed a book. So I'm going to try to boil it down into a Cliff Notes version, which is difficult. The sort of stylized history of school vouchers is that Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, came up with this idea in 1955. And then nothing really happened until 1990 in Milwaukee, when this sort of unusual political coalition creates the first modern voucher program. The actual history I found is more nuanced and it's more interesting. Milton Friedman did propose school vouchers in 1955. At the same time, there was a priest who was advocating for school vouchers as sort of as religious liberty. He thought that it was discrimination against religious families, that they had to pay taxes for public education and also pay tuition to go to schools that reflected their values. Unfortunately, at the same time, Southern segregationists were already enacting school voucher programs in the South to thwart Brown versus Board of Education. The courts eventually dismantled those programs, but it sort of sets up, that time period sets up a lot of the same issues that we hear about today. I want to say too that in the 60s and 70s, progressive and sort of liberal voices joined in asking for school vouchers and advocating for school vouchers as a tool of empowerment for low-income families, particularly low-income families of color. And eventually in the 90s, Milwaukee did pass the first modern program. Cleveland passed a program. And there were always, from that period of time, there were always questions about the legality of it. There were questions about the First Amendment. There were questions about who the program should be for, what income they should target. All of these questions were always circling around these programs. And then some of the legal questions were resolved to some extent by the Supreme Court in 2002 when they upheld Cleveland's school voucher program. And then we've seen a few different times, a few different years where there was a lot of legislation for school vouchers. The last few, also after the 2010 midterms, there was kind of a wave of legislation. And so we're kind of seeing that again now, I think partly because of the pandemic and also because existing programs, it's easy to expand something that's already there. To some extent, you know, there's support from the people who are already using the programs. And so we're in the middle of seeing another wave of this right now.
Thank you. Darrell, you know, I know that these programs are coming on fast and furious. Some would argue that there doesn't seem to be a huge rush to use these vouchers by parents, or they're some of the people that are taking them up or already had their children enrolled in private school. Is that what you think, or why is that? And what are you hearing from parents about their options?
Yeah, so the one thing I will say is that despite your summary at the beginning, a voucher purist would argue that these things, that vouchers and ESAs and tax credits and all these other things are not the same thing. And in particular, they would argue that an ESA is absolutely not the same thing because a voucher gets you a seat in a school discreetly, and an education savings account could get you a seat, but could also let you do many other things, which is sort of an important distinction. So I think what parents are telling us is that they, and the word choice is really important, is that they want significantly more control over the education of their children. And that can manifest itself in a lot of ways. One way it can manifest itself is as I want a voucher, or I want an education savings account. But another way, and we've seen this sort of like positively and negatively, is that like we want more influence on curriculum. So you can look at the sort of curriculum wars of the parental rights movement as one manifestation of that, and you can look at the sort of growing movement of African-American parents who do not feel like their children get a fair shake in the curriculum of their traditional public schools who are choosing homeschooling, for instance, as another way that manifests itself. I won't say whether or not I think we're overstating it or not, but I absolutely think the pandemic has been sort of catalytic in all of this. And perhaps the most important thing about what it has catalyzed is interest in and or consternation amongst families who thought they had it all fixed because they had the right mortgage and got the right house. And so the thing that I think is very different now versus like other years of school choice, as I think Kara sort of intimated earlier, is that there are more people who are interested in the policy, and there are different people who are interested in the policy. School choice is very popular among African-American and Hispanic parents, and I think there's significant polling on that shows in the high 50s, 60s, even on ESAs, not just on charters, which I know this isn't about, or vouchers or whatever. But the interest in these sorts of policies has certainly grown, and I think obviously the last 2.5 years have had some role to play in that.
Jessica, you've successfully sued to stop voucher expansion in some places. What do you hear parents saying? I think you guys, I don't know if you guys are talking to the same parents or different parents, but my guess is there's lots of different parent views on this.
Certainly. Yeah, I think it's first important to address what Darrell was saying about vouchers and what we call these things. If by vouchers we mean a program that uses public money to pay for private education, and that is how the public understands vouchers and why the term voucher is very unpopular. If that's what we mean by voucher and that's what it means at its base, then ESAs and tax credit vouchers, these all are programs that at their base use public money and send it to private education. And it's true that ESAs are not the same as conventional vouchers, which were just for tuition. ESAs are even worse than conventional vouchers in that they have even less academic standards, even less accountability for where the money goes and a broader potential use of the money. They often include homeschooling, which conventional vouchers didn't, with a huge lack of regulation. So a lack of protection for academics and educational outcomes for students, a lack of standards and guardrails about what the money can be used for. That's the difference, but I don't think the difference between ESAs and vouchers is a positive one for the privatization movement. In terms of what parents are saying, I think it's first important to remember that parents do have a lot of options within the public school universe, and that parents utilize all the time: intra-district choice, magnet schools, etc. So it's not as though we need private school vouchers in order to give parents any leeway or any control to make choices that they think are right for their students. But what are we hearing parents say about voucher programs? Families in particular with higher needs students are often not well served by private school vouchers. And those are a lot of the parents, for example, that we talk to and that I would encourage reporters to talk to, and happy to help you put you in touch with parents who talk about how they may have, for example, taken a voucher for their student with disabilities and realized later on that they were not being well served in the private school, that the private school may kick them out or refuse to serve them down the road. The parent may often doesn't realize that they've lost most of their IDEA rights when they take a voucher. So these are a lot of the things that we hear parents saying. And I also think it's great for reporters to talk to grassroots groups of parents and community members across the country who are opposing vouchers. Just to name a couple of great examples: Save Our Schools Arizona, Illinois Families for Public Schools. And again, happy to help you make these connections to people who are on the ground. So that's some of what we're hearing from parents who want the focus to be on public schools and funding public schools where all students are welcome and served, and also parents who may have taken a voucher and then had that negative experience.
Thank you. Kara, what does the research say about how effective vouchers are? I know parents may feel one way or another about them, but are they helping students? Tell me what you know.
So I feel like I'm like sandwiched between Jessica and Jarrell on this.
I'm trying to be the good guy at this point. I'm still,
So it's interesting because I think that both sides of this issue have a tendency to kind of go all in on the research that fits their position to some extent. And I think it's after 30 some years of these things existing, it's a little bit more nuanced and complicated that. And I also think it's important to, as reporters, to keep in mind that one study is one study, and to also be aware of the researchers that you're talking to. Some researchers are advocates one way or another. And so, just be aware when you're looking at this, that there is a body of research, and studies may over time point in a direction, and that direction also could change. So I think as education reporters, a lot of us are familiar with reading studies and looking at research, but this is an issue where it's particularly volatile in some ways. And so I just want to put that out there. I think the research is a little bit complicated. I think that voucher programs there are multiple studies showing that voucher programs have not had a positive effect on test scores, particularly math. Recent studies have showed a decline in math scores. So that's a little bit troubling. There are studies done by people who support choice who have found that to be the case in some of the prominent programs out there. There's also some research showing that there's some positive effects on life outcomes in some of these programs, that that participants are more likely to attend college or graduate high school, less likely to be involved in criminal behavior. So I don't think that the research is a clear win for advocates of choice, but I also don't think that it is a clear failure. And it's interesting to me when you look at sort of the history of it, because when these programs very first started, it was a little bit up in the air as to how you even evaluate them. And when they started, they were very small. And so over time, we've kind of seen better methods of evaluation of these programs. But at the time that some of them started, I think that people really thought that this was going to improve public education, and that there was sort of this assumption that children would be getting a better education in a private school. And some of those assumptions have not turned out to be true. It really hasn't been like a panacea for the ills of public education.
Yeah, can I build on that, Kara? Is that okay? Yeah, I think that any policy at any given time has a different rationale based on what the moment is. And I know that in my career, I've thought about the idea that parents and kids should have access to the school that works best for them in a lot of different ways. At one point, as a mechanism to drive improvement in public schools. At another point, as a way to just sort of like match a better seat with a child who was prepared for one. At one point, as a way to unlock the future of what I think our education systems, need to be, and myriad other instances along the way. So I think this is a thing that is natural to public policy. So I just want to throw that out there. I think that's really important. The other thing, though, that I just want to get on right now, and I didn't want to do this, but I think it's important. So right now in America, there is a split screen. There's a split screen response happening. We have long-held systems of measurement and accountability that are supposed to help us improve our public schools and engage people, in the process of their improvement. Those things have sort of weighted the rubrics for success toward government, right? Governments, the federal government, state government, local government, school boards, these kinds of things, overwhelmingly, and engage parents like a little bit. if you look at, you can also look at what's going on in Arkansas, Arizona, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Iowa, right? Florida, quite possibly, as another view on that, where states are saying, look, we're looking at the accountability metrics that, the accountability approach we've had over the last 20 years, really, go back to the kickoff of the NCLB era. Like, that approach got us some good things, certainly helped us create some good things, but, only one in five Black fourth graders in America in 2018 tested at or above proficient on the NAEP. So clearly there are gaps with the public accountability system we have now. And some folks are saying, let's try this the other way. Like, what would we do if instead we decided we wanted to weight the parents' view significantly more? And we wanted to support that view by financing it. And we wanted to be, more all in on that. And our accountability mechanisms would be different than they were. And that's a fascinating hypothesis, right? That's a very interesting question to have. And both of these questions are being asked at the same time right now, right? And so I would also urge anybody watching this webinar to think about this in terms of, look, there are lots of ways to figure out whether or not something is good. There are, or whether or not something is working. There are lots of people that something needs to work for it to be worthwhile for us to do it. And some states have just decided that they want to try a different way. So whether or not you care about assembling education or not assembling education, or you think vouchers are a bad idea, as Jessica does, or a really good idea, as I do for myriad reasons I'm having to get into later, this sort of change in accountability policy is actually really important and does deserve to be sort of observed in that light.
And if I could just add on just 2 quick points on Jarrell, because I think you're saying a lot of interesting things here that are key parts of the debate. I think that the metric that voucher proponents want to use to measure voucher success is changing because vouchers aren't meeting any of those metrics. So as Kara mentioned, sometimes studies start out and they move in a certain direction. I would argue and encourage everyone to look at the research on Public Funds Public Schools research page, pfps.org/research. We list a lot of these studies, and if we're missing something that you think is a high quality study, write to us. But the way that these studies have gone is moving from studies of those small scale programs to larger studies as we've gathered more data. And as we go, the trend of the evidence is clear that vouchers have a negative effect on educational outcomes. And that, I would say, is why the goalpost has been moved by the pro-voucher side to things like parental satisfaction. I think they're hard-pressed, though, to come up with a metric on which vouchers are performing well, but I would say that's why it keeps moving. And in terms of accountability and parental involvement, public schools are the places where we have laws about accountability. As Jarrell is saying, we have a lot of laws about accountability. Public schools are the places where laws like the IDEA actually guarantee parental involvement. I think the voucher proponents would have us get rid of accountability, get rid of those anti-discrimination laws, or not have them apply in these programs because that's how they work. And I think that is not the way to improve the schools and to improve people's rights, to sort of abandon that project. Public schools are not perfect by any means, and we're certainly not arguing that, but they are the place where we are fighting for them to be more inclusive, to have better academic outcomes, to be anti-discriminatory, and removing those protections, which is what voucher programs do, isn't the way to get to those goals.
Kara, I hate to exacerbate your problem and catch you in the middle, but I do. So one, I just want to say that I'm not for underweighting parental satisfaction. I do think it's incredibly important that parents are satisfied with their school choices, and certainly the housing market is a proxy for that. So I just want to throw that out there. I think that matters a great deal. The other thing is that I've spent a lot of time in my life working on public school accountability, which normally is public school transparency, because sanctions and or change are rarely meted out in the presence of unfortunate or underwhelming results. And I just want to say that I don't know who these fictitious voucher advocates are who don't care about measurement, who don't care about regulation and all this stuff. Like, if maybe that's a different webinar. But if you want to talk to this one who helped design the teacher evaluation framework for the state of New Jersey, who has been a longtime advocate of a parent's right to know in myriad forms, I'm happy to discuss those issues with anybody.
So I was going to interject to come back full circle. Just for the reporters who are listening, I was going to say, I can't drop it in the chat, but just a plug for Matt Barnum, who works with me at Chalkbeat. He's written a roundup that he updates from time to time that it's basically a roundup of voucher studies. And I think that Matt is a very careful and nuanced reporter. And also there's a bunch of links in there to some of the most recent studies and kind of an explanation of some of the different research. So I was just going to put that out there that I could probably send it out afterward, but I before I worked with Matt, I thought that was a real service, for reporters out there, because it's national. So I wanted to.
And I'm happy to do the same. Yeah.
I also, just on the one point on the accountability issue that I think is interesting, again, as someone who is not on a side but has covered this, for a long time in Florida, I covered education. For reporters, what's important to know, I think, and to look into when you're covering some of these issues, is that different state programs, different private school choice programs in different states have actually kind of an array of accountability measures that range pretty widely, actually. And so I think that when you're covering this, it's important to look into that and to see, because there's a variety of opinions, I think, within the school choice movement about how to regulate these programs and whether to regulate these programs. And you see that play out in some of the states. So in Florida, I'm going to try to get this right, but in Florida, I think the kids have to take, for some of the programs, a norm reference test, but not necessarily the state standardized test that the public school students take. In Wisconsin, you can look up, in Milwaukee, I did this when I visited some schools, you can look up the differences, their accountability measures for a private school that accepts vouchers compared to like the public school down the road, and they're taking the same test. And so I just want to put it out there that these programs do vary quite a bit in how they regulate. And I think Indiana is another one where you can, the kids are taking essentially the same state test. And so you can debate whether or not that's a good thing or whether or not the program should exist, but it varies quite a bit. And in some places there's a lot of regulation, and in some places there's very, very little. So just to put that out there.
And I'm wondering which of you can speak to this, but in terms of some of the newer programs that have been created, I think there has been some question about oversight of how, not just necessarily how the students are performing or parent satisfaction, but some of it is with these more open-ended programs like empowerment scholarships, how people are spending the money. I appreciate that there are definitely questions about how some public schools spend their dollars as well, but is there, how the newer legislation that's come out, are there accountability measures specifically tied to the spending, or could they be improved upon?
You want to go first, Jessica?
Sure, thanks. Well, I think Kara's absolutely right. You need to look at the individual legislation, but I think that when you do, what you see is pretty shocking. There sometimes are some more accountability measures, but they're nowhere near the accountability that we have for public dollars in public schools. But this is the same public money. This is often hundreds of millions of dollars or even reaching billions of dollars annually in Florida on voucher programs. So why do we not have anywhere near the same type of public accountability? As for the newer programs or the newer expansions, take, for example, Arizona, where they in 2022 expanded their ESA to be universal and are very rapidly approving expenses in their ESA, which is very broad allowability for what you can use the ESA on, even though in the past, Arizona's own government agencies have found misuse of the ESA funds. Despite that, this is again another example of despite the evidence, these policies being expanded and pushed through. And you'll also see things in this legislation having to do with very strong protections for what private schools can do. So for who they can refuse to admit, that they don't have to change their creed or their admissions policies or anything else about what they're doing in order to join a voucher program. So there's a lot of protection for private schools and their choice in this legislation compared to, I think that makes the stark contrast with the relatively very small amount of protections and guardrails for the students who are using the programs in the legislation.
Yeah, I don't know whether or not I want to say I'm not sure I agree with that. So, the Arizona program, I think is interesting. Certainly the mechanism of an ESA in Arizona has been studied for a pretty long time because the first implementation of it was one for special needs students, which I'm sure Jessica knows. And I think there are 42,000 families who signed up for the expansion, which is something like 1% of all Arizona public school kids. So it's not a rush for the hills, and it's sort of like not an overwhelming number of folks to deal with. A couple of things though. One, there are some systems and platforms already in place. Actually, there's a sort of a growing movement of tech folk who are helping states implement and manage the spending details of these programs. There's Class Wallet is the one that is has been used most and is kind of was a creature of helping teachers buy things and expend things. And so that's one that people sort of know the most. There's Odyssey, there's a couple of other ones. So that too, I think, for a reporter is an interesting story about how a state provides transparency around expenditures in a new program of this nature. The other thing I would just say, look, I was talking to some elected officials in Nevada. I didn't pull that out of my hat, Jessica. This is the last time I talked to some elected officials. And I told them, listen, anytime you're trying to bring something new into existence with public policy, something unexpected is going to happen. You can just define unexpected of lots of ways. The important thing is to sort of be ready for it. And so there's no, in Oklahoma, for instance, they used $50 million of their COVID relief aid, their GEAR funds, I think is what it was, to help families with educational expenses, as did Nebraska and Iowa. It was Nebraska, Kansas, North Carolina, and a bunch of other states. And there was a story that came out that basically said, 1% of the money had been used for things that were deemed questionable. And then the whole middle of the story was that 99% of the money had been used for things that were unquestionable. But it turned out that the thing that people were questioning were televisions, which also are computer monitors, right? And so I just think that there is, the 74 had a piece about this the other day about ESA spending. And I know reporters don't write their own headlines. The headline was terrible. The story was pretty moderate, right? About things that people are using education savings accounts for. And that maybe the more illuminating piece was an op-ed that, well, not an op-ed, a blog. How about that? I'll make a blog, so déclassé, that was written at by somebody at the Fordham Institute that looked at Donors Choose and found all the same things that parents are buying with their ESA those are things that teachers want too. So like tickets to SeaWorld, there's like tons of teachers who want to take their kids to SeaWorld. Like a trampoline, there's tons of teachers who want trampolines. A chicken coop, no less, right? You can find no less than 10 teachers in the country who want to buy a chicken coop to teach, sort of biology and that kind of stuff. So I think, again, the most important thing about reporting on these stories is to recognize the newness of the program. Give parents, the opportunity to show you that they care about their kids because they do. Observe it from a place of assuming the best intentions, and understand that if something does go sideways, that is also just a byproduct of creating something new.
Well, Carol, if I could ask you, I'm so sorry. We just had, since we're talking about accountability, there's a question from Annie Martin from the Orlando Sentinel in the chat. It thought it make sense to answer that here. She's asking, what types of formal accountability and transparency requirements would you support for schools that take vouchers? Should they have to publicly report their standardized test scores? As Kara told us, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of, whether those students are even required to take tests, much less publicly report them. Should they have to publicly report their graduation rates, disclose qualifications for their teachers, disclose what textbooks they use? And she's saying that I'm sure you're aware Florida does not require any of these.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I could give you one answer on it right now. I kind of just want to say the answer is yes, because if you add up all the sort of state programs, to Kara's point of earlier, they all in one way or another have some elements of this stuff, right? So Louisiana, for instance, which is sort of to some of the things Jessica said earlier, and also I know Kara knows this. It's a very highly regulated approach. It requires everybody take the same state tests and a few other things, and the results have not been great. John White sort of quarterbacked, most of that, and so again, the results aren't spectacular. In the Arkansas proposal, for instance, there is accreditation for private schools participating in their ESA. But it doesn't dictate what the accrediting entity needs to be. So there are multiple ones, and students have to take the state test. But students have to take a norm reference test, but that could be the state test, but doesn't have to be. In a lot of tax credit scholarship programs, just another manifestation of this, where normally there's what's called a scholarship granting organization. That's like a nonprofit, like the Children's Scholarship Fund, for instance, or any other local organization that gives out scholarships for kids. The transparency there, or the accountability there, is normally financial, like have an audit that is done every year, have strong financial controls that are overseen and approved by another entity. So unlike I would say, even though there's tremendous variation in charter laws, for instance, just as there's tremendous variation in how traditional public schools hold themselves accountable, there are a lot of different ways to figure out whether or not a program is working or not. And the things that will be chosen will normally reflect the value of the program. And if one of the things you want to do is have a voucher program that's meant to close the cheating gas for low-income kids, you might choose different things than if what you want to do is help more kids have an opportunity to just match with the school that works best for them.
Jessica, I know you wanted to say something. Let you make your point as well.
Sure, thanks so much. Well, the point I'll make on the accountability is that Public Funds Public Schools doesn't think that there's anything you can do that you can put in these voucher laws that will actually make them good policy. You can put some more accountability in them. It would be great to have more information, for example, on demographics, so that we can better measure segregative effects, on test scores so that we can better measure these academic outcomes, on things like how many students with disabilities these programs are serving, because we have serious concerns about that. So it'd be good to have that information. But for example, in Arkansas, where they passed a law a few years ago to put some more reporting requirements on their existing voucher programs. So I'm not talking about the new voucher proposal that came out recently, but their existing voucher program. They got the state report and basically concluded that, look, this isn't working that well. Private schools are not, all of them are not reporting the data. We can't really compare apples to oranges here from what we've mandated. So even trying to put those accountability requirements on the program didn't work very well for Arkansas. So we don't think that is a fix here, but certainly it would be wonderful to have more information about these programs. In terms of, Darrell, you mentioned who are these mythical people who don't want accountability measures on voucher programs. I would say the legislators who are passing them are not adding more accountability measures. So those are some of the people who are against accountability measures for these programs. And I would say it's because they don't want accountability for these programs. The last thing I want to say is that I don't agree, Darrell, that we should wait and see because new policies take time. When we know what works in public schools, we know what gets better results for students. We just need to fund it. But these programs are taking funding away from public schools. I also don't think that we can afford to take a wait and see approach when we know that kids are being harmed by voucher programs, when we know that they're suffering academically, when we know that kids are being discriminated against by private schools. I think we ought to stop funding those private schools through voucher programs right away and not wait and see. I think the other really important statistic about Arizona, because you talked about the uptake of Arizona and what percentage that is of the public school students. I think the other important statistic is that about 75% of the applicants to the expanded voucher program are already in private school. And that's, I think, another thing that voucher proponents don't want people to know, or that they certainly don't publicize, that most of the kids who are now taking vouchers, especially as the limits come off and universal voucher programs are being proposed and passed with no means testing and things like that, is that the majority of students who are then uptaking the vouchers are already in private school. These are families already affording it. So they're not going to the lower income students or the populations that proponents say they are meant for. And those types of statistics have been reflected, for example, in New Hampshire's voucher program. It also means that the program costs hundreds of millions of dollars more than is projected by those who don't recognize that the uptake is going to be from students who are already in private school. So the last stat I think is really important in this conversation that we're having is parental satisfaction, because I completely agree that parental satisfaction is another important metric, but recent polls show that the overwhelming majority of families in public schools were happy with how their public school handled the pandemic and that they're happy with their local public school. I think it was somewhere around 80%. And I'm happy to provide the links for that. And I think that that's really important because I had a college professor who would ask, is this a new story or an old story? And I think that there were new things that happened during the pandemic. Certainly there's a new spin on things, but the old story is underfunding and starving of public schools and then calling them failures, rather than doing the things that research backed shows will improve education for all students in public schools and actually funding that and giving every student their constitutionally guaranteed education. So I will stop, but I thought those were some important statistics to throw out there.
I would like to speak to Kara, unless you want to speak to something.
Can I just ask, there's one question in the chat. I'm wondering, Kara, if you know this, it's from Patrick O'Donnell. He's just wondering if there is, like you pointed out, the great list that Matt Barnum keeps on terms of voucher research, but is there a list somewhere that you know of about accountability requirements by state compared with public schools? Is there anything like that you're aware of that kind of tracks something like that? I just thought we would sneak that question in, Darrell, and then I'll let you go ahead.
I don't know if there's like a nationwide comparison of accountability systems for existing choice programs compared to the public school accountability system. That would certainly be a service if someone hasn't done it already. I would say EdChoice is an advocacy organization, but they do have a pretty handy map with all of the different private school choice programs in the country. And I don't know who has to update that, but right now must be just incredibly stressful for that person. But if you click on it, it'll show the different programs, and they have, pretty helpful information about how much, that particular program's voucher or ESA is worth. It has some of the legal history. If the program has ever been, contested in court, it'll have some of that information. It has, when the program was passed. It has just a lot of information on EdChoice's website. So I would point that out as a resource for reporters to check the private school choice program to then see how that compares to the state accountability. I think they would have to do some research on that. But
yeah, the only thing I'll add is I know there's, for example, a GAO report, but that only covers tax credit vouchers. So there are a number of things. I don't know of one that covers every voucher program and what the accountability measures are. But for example, there's a GAO report on what accountability measures there are in tax credit voucher programs. I don't think directly compare to public schools, as Kara was saying. That would be a great tool.
Yeah. But maybe someone on the webinar would like to take that on and then let the rest
and then share it with all of us.
Yeah, yes. Share it with all of us, because that would be a real service. So
there was also an report. Oh, sorry, Nirvi. There was also an report, I think, last year that cataloged a lot of the lack of accountability measures and a lot of voucher programs. So again, not a comparison to public schools, but that's pretty recent.
Jessica, you brought up tax credit scholarships. I want to circle back to that, but Darrell, I want you to be able to make your final point, and then there's a question about tax credit scholarships and vouchers as well, so we can come back to that for the audience, just to distinguish them. They do the mechanics of which are slightly different, even if the execution is very similar. But please, Darrell, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would just say, and I know this isn't about mixing school metaphors, but because something is different doesn't mean it's lacking. And I think if you want to have a discussion about every school in America being regulated exactly the same way, that is a very different discussion. Maybe we should have it. But the fact that some states are choosing to regulate private school choice programs differently than they regulate the public schools that they control directly, I think is a matter of policy and not necessarily a matter of bad policy. That's the first thing. The second thing I would just say, which I think is sort of is just interesting, is that what I'm gathering from Jessica is that it doesn't matter whether or not the program is for low-income kids or for everybody. She opposes it, which is fine. I just think it is important to also say that there are plenty of ways that we subsidize people's choices of exclusive public schools through SALT, for instance, which is like the favorite tax credit. It's the favorite tax deduction for anybody who lives in an expensive school district. We discriminate routinely against kids in America's public schools based on where they live. And though in a state like New Jersey, for instance, where I am, it is prohibited to be segregated in the military and in the public schools, the New Jersey public school system is consistently in the top 5 in segregated schools in America. So I just want us to have, I understand why people fear these things. I fear them too. However, I think we have to have an honest conversation about the programs that we might want versus the public schools that we have, not the public schools that we think we have. And maybe more pointedly, I don't think in 2023, given the last 2.5 years of schooling in America, that I'm particularly interested in having a competitive conversation about whether or not families should have more opportunities to find the best school to find the school that works best for them. I think there are lots of governors who feel the same way, and whether or not anybody thinks that we shouldn't be attempting these things, they are being attempted. Not in my state, but certainly in states that could wind up having 20 to 30% of America's kids involved in these programs. Certainly there will be people who oppose them, and there are people who oppose them, and that is fine. I think it is more constructive to examine what states are doing. Hopefully we get something that looks like the benefits of federalism, and states build on what they learn from each other. And more children are being afforded the opportunity to go to schools that are going to give them the education that works best for them. So I have a very optimistic view about the next 3 to 5 years, and I would encourage reporters to look at it that way as well.
I'm seeing our hour just kind of really fly by. So I did want to follow up quickly. I do want to get back to the tax credit scholarship question, because that's a question from a reporter in Oklahoma. But Darrell, there have been comments made by some people in the, I don't know if you would call it advocacy of private school vouchers or empowerment scholarships, but you've heard these terms, let's lay siege to the institutions and I want to destroy public education. There was a lobbyist that was caught on record saying those kinds of things. Is that a concern? Like, what are the motivations? Is it to help parents and kids, or is there, are those just anomalies in the conversation about some of these programs?
Yeah, I would just say that listen, lots of people are gonna continue to choose their public school, and I'm totally supportive of that. I just think that your address, how much money you make, and the color of your skin shouldn't be the three prime factors that determine whether or not you get to go to the school that works best for you. And I think in particular over the last 3 to 5 years, again, I sort of mentioned it almost exhaustively, this is not a fight I'm interested in having. I think there are lots of ways to create great schools for families. There are lots of kinds of governance that help you create those schools. Traditional district school governance is one way to do it. I'd like to see a system that helps families get to the schools that work best for them. That is my highest and best priority. That is what the people who work with me in 9 different states believe. And if somebody else believes something else, I think that's just up to them.
I do want to get back to this question from Beth Wallace at State Impact Oklahoma. She asks about Oklahoma looking to pass legislation that uses tax credits. What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of a system like this? Is it too novel or new to tell yet? One thing I'll quickly say is that other states have a ton of these, so I don't think it's totally new, even if it's new to Oklahoma, but I'd love the panelists for you all to weigh in on that question.
No, but it's new because it's refundable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kara, Jessica, do you guys want to talk to this instead? I just want to make sure. Okay. So normally when you use a tax credit, a business or an individual gets a tax credit for donating to a scholarship granting organization, which I mentioned earlier, and that gives out scholarships to low-income kids. This is a refundable tax credit to an individual. So I spend the money and the state pays me back for it. And I don't know what the device is, but they're working on something to help low-income families get on this. So it's because one of the challenges is always well, I'd do it if I had the money up front, It is very novel. I don't think there's any state that has a program like this. And I too am interested in seeing if it gets out of the Senate. I think it's up in the Senate now, but yeah, it's very novel, and I'm looking to see where it goes.
I would just add to say that, yes, there are some differences here, but just like the way that vouchers, as we were talking about a while ago, have morphed to be ESAs, to be tax credit vouchers, they have the same issues, which is going to be hurting educational attainment, potentially exacerbating segregation, allowing discrimination. And so just to get back to the sort of broader idea of tax credit vouchers, I think that, again, like ESAs, it's sort of just a worse iteration of the original idea in that, for example, when you have these 2 layers, first the voucher granting organization, the scholarship granting organization, and then granting a voucher to a private school or sometimes to an ESA range of private education expenses, just honestly more opportunities for there to be a lack of accountability and for there to be things like discrimination. We haven't talked that much about discrimination, and I think it's an essential point that I just want to make sure is on reporters' radar, which is that it's very hard to deny that vouchers fund discrimination. That is not to say that every private school or provider discriminates, but there are many that put these discriminatory policies right in their handbook, right on their websites. For example, that we won't serve students with disabilities, or we don't serve students with certain disabilities, or we won't take LGBTQ students or families, or we won't take students of one religion or another, or families that aren't this religion or the other. And so this is is public money going to organizations that are allowed to discriminate. I don't think that fact can be overlooked. It's extremely important when we say we want to give people more choices. Again, we're giving private schools choices. That's the reality. And we are also only giving some students choices, the students that fit the bill of these programs. For example, in West Virginia, there are basically no private schools that serve students with disabilities. So you're enacting a program that basically excludes a huge portion of vulnerable public school students, of the student population. And that's something that I think voucher proponents don't want to talk about, but it's really important to talk about in writing about this.
Yeah, and I would just like to say, I'd be happy to talk about it. You know, I went to an all-boys high school, and an all-boys high school discriminates against women. I think there's a nuanced conversation to be had about about school culture and school fit that is often sort of like boogeyman. It's this conversation about discrimination, federal civil rights law. Yeah, we should have it, but I think we should have it seriously. The other thing I would just say, I can't remember the other thing I was going to say because I got really frustrated. Listen, I know we're up on it. I think everybody who is reporting on this, I just want you to think about asking 3 questions when you take on this issue, right? The first one is, what is different about a 4-year-old than a 5-year-old and an 18-year-old than a 19-year-old? Because if you're 3 years old or 4 years old, you live in a world of mixed delivery, public, private, religious-based pre-K. If you're in New Jersey, where I am, the state will give you a significant amount of money to pick the pre-K that you want, and that is lauded. If you're in the higher ed space, we do the same thing, but there's something different about K-12. So I would ask everybody to ask that. The second thing I would say, and this is what I was going to say, is, you know, are people who are against public money going to private schools, are they ready to outlaw private placement for special needs kids under IDEA? Are they ready to eliminate transportation, textbook aid, nursing aid, and all the other streams of revenue that routinely go from state coffers to private schools today, right? To schools that do all the things that Jessica has talked about. Like, I'd love to know that too. And then the third thing, which is like, actually, I think very important, ask people where they or their own kids go to school. Because, and this is an advocacy point, there are a lot of people who oppose giving parents the same opportunity to send kids to school, to private schools, for instance, as one instance, that went to them themselves. And to me, and in the name of democracy or some other thing. And to me, if it is so important that somebody else must send their child to this school, it must be important enough for you to send your child to this school as well. And you should ask that, because motivations, as we've talked about many times during this conversation, are important. Mine have always been the same. I want every kid to have the same opportunity that I had. If they can get in a public school that they live next to, that's great. If they get into the charter school, I'm very happy about that. If the state finances them to go to a private school, I'm excited about that too, because an educated public is a public good, right? Like that is my stance on this. So I would counsel all reporters to ask those 3 questions, and I look forward to reading whatever you're going to write over the next few years.
Really quick.
Almost out of time, Nervi, or how are we doing on time?
We have a couple minutes left. Kara, I'd love for you to chime in. I know story ideas and stuff like that. I'd love for you to flag anything, but go ahead with what you're going to say.
Well, I didn't want to open like an entirely new can of worms, but I do think I wanted to flag that some of the legal questions here are interesting and ongoing, especially around discrimination. And in the most recent Supreme Court case, Carson versus Macon, which basically the Supreme Court has sort of gone it's gone a direction over the last 20 some years where it's been more permissive as far as sending public dollars to private schools. The most recent case basically said that it's an issue of religious discrimination, that if a state has a program where they choose to fund private education in some way through a school choice program, that they have to include the religious schools. And in that case, one of the dissenting justices brought up this issue of discrimination because she was making the point, and I believe it was Justice Sotomayor, but she was making the point that to not discriminate against religious schools in these programs, you may also be funding a different type of discrimination by giving money to schools that have religious values where, you know, they're not going to have gay teachers or they're not going to admit gay students. And so I just want to flag that as kind of an interesting and ongoing issue in the world of litigation around these programs.
Yeah. It's great that a Catholic school graduate would point that out as well. So
we have like literally 1 minute left. There's one more question I'd love to squeeze in quickly if someone can answer super briefly, from Camille Phillips, Texas Public Radio. Do you know if Florida and Wisconsin track how many of their students using voucher-like programs were never enrolled in public schools? Do other states do that? I can quickly say I know New Hampshire is one that has done that. I think Arizona is tracking that in terms of their new ESA program. I don't know if the panelists know of other states that are tracking that.
I believe there's data on Wisconsin, and I would be happy to dig that up and send it. It mirrors those other states in being 70, 80% of kids already in private schools.
And there's another question about the resources that all of you have mentioned. I know Education Writers Association is going to do their best to get some of those links and sources and share them with people who participated in our program today. And we're right at time. I'm sorry, there's this sort of a very abrupt end, but I'm so glad it was such a robust discussion today. Thank you again, Darrell Bradford, Kara Fitzpatrick, Jessica Levin, and thank you all of you for participating and sharing your good questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to everything. Have a great day. Please fill out the survey and we will be in touch. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.